Talk about again that tragedy. And this particular tragedy, it was one that was such that BJJ never recuperated from it. And had this tragedy not happened, for sure, BJJ would be much different than it is today. Okay, Rolls Gracie. Rolls Gracie. Rolls Gracie was the son of Carlos Gracie, who had an affair. Carlos Gracie's wife did not want holes there, and you can look it up. I'm just going to skim over top so I can get to the meat of the matter, because it was actually a sad thing. Carlos Gracie's wife did not want holes in the house, right? She didn't feel like she could live under those circumstances with him having had a son out of wedlock or a son outside the marriage, and it was just a little too much for her to deal with. So Carlos requested that Helio take him and raise him as his son, and Helio relented and did raise him as his son. Holes never really felt like he was one of Helio's sons, which he wasn't, but he expected to be treated as such. He always felt that Rorion was favored, right? He always felt that way. So he always went out of his way to be the very best Gracie, and some people say he was. What he did was, he was the first one really to understand the value of wrestling. Holes knew that BJJ wasn't the end all be all, right? He loved BJJ, but he didn't buy into the myth that Helio was pushing on everyone, which was, by itself, it is a complete martial art. Don't just look at it as a base. Don't just look at it as your primary template, your primary structure, your primary foundation, and build on it. See it as the only thing, just the only thing. Well, Holes wasn't buying it. Holes knew there were certain things missing, like takedowns, right? He wanted to have ballistic takedowns to go with what was peculiar about him. What was very peculiar about Holes, more than what you see today, was he was extremely aggressive. His jiu-jitsu was extremely aggressive. It was so aggressive that Hickson is said to have believed many times that Holes was bullying him, because he would snatch at the gi, he would pull on Hickson, he would throw Hickson. He was his jiu-jitsu was extremely aggressive. And if you didn't know who he was, if you didn't have a good relationship with him, you would misconstrue his intentions to just be aggressive and to make his jiu-jitsu all it could be. You would misconstrue that and think he was being hostile, which he was not. But it was so aggressive, as I said, Hickson oftentimes thought that Holes was actually bullying him. But Holes wanted his jiu-jitsu to be the very best. So he did something that Helio absolutely hated. He went outside of BJJ and he started to learn wrestling takedowns. He started to learn how to pin, breakdowns, when people were in the turtle position, how to use the seatbelt, how to use the referee, what's called the referee position, and things of that nature, and breakdowns from the referee position. He started to want to compete in wrestling tournaments. He was introduced at one point to a man by Bob Anderson, right, who was actually later the coach of Randy Couture. He met Bob Anderson, and they became immediate friends. Well, Bob is a great wrestling coach, great wrestling teacher, so he started working with Holes after being fascinated with Holes, his overall talent, even in BJJ, his overall grappling talent. Well, Helio hated that. He hated the fact that Holes wanted to cross-train, that Holes wanted to bring in wrestling. He wanted to bring in elements of Sambo. He wanted to compete in Sambo. He wanted to compete in wrestling. Helio absolutely hated it, and even at that point, whereas Holes felt somehow ostracized by Helio in the first place, Helio started to make it obvious that he didn't approve of Holmes and what Holmes was doing, and he started to ostracize him even more. He ostracized him so much so that he pushed his family to do the same thing. Now, Rorion has never been my favorite Gracie. Now, I don't know him personally, but there's something about him, stories I heard about him, that, and not knowing him personally, maybe people say I shouldn't take it, so literally, but there are things about him that troubles me. And one of the things is that he was very supportive of any dogma, of any propaganda, of any vanguard of the myth of BJJ being the end all and be all. And I know this was for profit, and I know some of it was out of love for his father, Helio. But what he did to Holmes, I don't think he had to do. Holmes at one point wanted to compete in the San Diego wrestling tournament. And he wanted to stay with Rorion, who at that particular time was living in California. Rorion refused to even allow his cousin, right, someone who was raised as his brother, to even allow him to bunk with him in his apartment or in his home just for maybe a weekend. So Holmes went and he found his friend and coach, Bob Anderson, and stayed with him. But Rorion absolutely refused to allow Holmes to stay with him in California while he competed in a wrestling tournament. And why? Because the whole myth of BJJ was going to be upheld no matter what and at any cost, even at the cost of ostracizing who many people believe was the greatest BJJ fighter of all the Gracies, who many people believe, who eyewitnesses believe, is the reason why Rickson became the warrior, the samurai, the Mike Tyson of the Gracie family. People believe it's because of Holmes' aggression and Holmes' teaching that made Rickson what Rickson actually became. But Rorion, at the orders, and maybe it wasn't too difficult for him, perhaps he didn't like Holmes in the first place. Perhaps he was jealous of Holmes in the first place. Perhaps maybe he felt that Holmes would eclipse him, right? But whether he had to be prided into doing it or not, or he did it voluntarily, he ostracized Holmes also to a large degree. This kind of antagonistic relationship and this kind of turning their back on the greatest fighter who was ever a Gracie actually did not stop until Holmes' death, I believe in a hang gliding accident where he died. The fact that Holmes was this cross-trainer, the fact that Holmes was aggressive in his BJJ, the fact that Holmes wanted to take wrestling and implement wrestling and bring wrestling in to his BJJ, to strengthen it, to harden it, to reinforce it. I believe BJJ never got over that. It never recuperated from that. And I believe it set it back. The evolution of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is seen by many people to be something. The fact of the matter is that had he lived, it would have moved leaps and bounds faster and above what it is currently. He is so missed, maybe not verbally, maybe not consciously, but to myself, he is so missed in the grappling world. And his value would have been so much, and his value is so missed. And the grappling world, and particularly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is made poorer, so much more poor because of his death. Poorer because of his death. I've said that Marcelo Garcia, to me, is the greatest grappler that I've ever seen. Whether it's Sambo, whether it's wrestling, whether it's BJJ, whether it's Khabib or Jordan Burroughs, whoever. I've never seen a grappler as creative in his prime, as pleasing to watch, with this beautiful combination of strategy, aggression, wrestling, submission, as MG, as Marcelo Garcia. Had Holmes lived, I think Marcelo Garcia would still have been the great grappler he is. But he would not have been so unusual, because that is where Holmes was essentially going. Today you find BJJ teachers or BJJ fighters, you see them implementing wrestling simply because they're in the UFC, because it's no gi, because they're in Bellator. Because if you're going to do no gi, then there are wrestling techniques, it's in particularly takedowns and riding, right? Pressure riding that you are going to have to learn to strengthen, in my opinion, and be all you can be in no gi. I think that would have been the norm had Rolls Gracie survived. Had he lived up until this point, I think that would have been the norm. That BJJ practitioners would not be waiting until they got into the UFC. That in fact, in their particular schools, wherever they were, they would know the value of cross-training, to take from wrestling what is good to strengthen BJJ, to take from Sambo what is good to strengthen BJJ, to take from Judo what is good and strengthen BJJ. But in particularly to mesh BJJ and wrestling together, I do think that that would have been the norm and not the exception had that great tragedy in BJJ and in the world of grappling and in the world of martial arts in particular had not happened when Rolls Gracie, the greatest of all the Gracies, the forerunner of much of what we see, the genius behind this mix in wrestling with BJJ, had he survived, then the short evolution or the slow evolution, which is slow considering where they should be, the slow evolution of BJJ certainly would have been would have been much faster, and it would have jumped leaps and bounds faster and beyond what it is today. In my opinion, grappling in general and BJJ in particular has never recuperated from the genius of Rolls Gracie. That's the end of the series. Whew. Thank you for your support. See you next video.